everybody, welcome to today's class plan. So today's video is going to cover the following topics. First, we're going to go over some housekeeping. Then I'm going to model a rhetorical analysis of a podcast. Then I'm going to show you how to access the Google Doc, where I ask you to perform your own collaborative rhetorical analysis of a podcast of your choice. And then finally, I'll do a brief overview of what to expect for next Tuesday. So housekeeping, so starting next week, I'll be keeping office hours remotely. That means I'm happy to meet via Skype at mckenna-rose.rose2, so the public Skype and not through the Georgia Tech system. I'll be available on Tuesday, November 7th from 4 to 5, and Wednesday, November 8th from 9 to 11, and then also by appointment, so email me if you want to talk. Quick note, there's been some sort of technical problem on Google's end, which means that some Google Docs are being randomly flagged as inappropriate. That happened to one group last week. I feel like Google has fixed it. If you want to read more about it, here's a link to a Vox article explaining that Google Docs is randomly flagging files for violations of its terms of service. If this applies to you, if you have been kicked out of your Google Doc and are no longer able to edit, just go ahead and send me an email and I will fix it for you. All right, so moving on to the rhetorical analysis of a podcast. So in today's video, I'm going to assess Radiolab Episode 8 according to the following criteria. So audience, overall structure or organization, the specific segments that are used, the way the audio is used, and then finally the conclusion. So without further ado, Radiolab is a podcast produced by WNYC. It plays both on the radio and then is available for free via subscription. I think partly because it's a radio podcast, it has super high production value and uses to great effect sound cues and repetition. The podcast is able to attract a lot of really great guests and has the resources to travel and do interviews and exposés, etc. But because of the guests and the production value, it engages its audience. It's also a great and engaging text because it pulls together audiences from both the humanities and the sciences, because the podcast itself is a podcast that blends science and humanities. So the overall structure of the podcast is pretty traditional. So it has a normal intro and outro. It begins with introductions and announces what has happened in previous episodes and what will come next. The online versions are peppered with advertisements. The specific episode that I'll get to in just a minute that I analyzed is comprised of 2 parts. The overall goal of which is to look at ways that different discourse communities construe what they mean by truth. And then when the podcast comes to an end, they promise to investigate production of truth in episodes to follow. So again, intro, outro, sound cues, specific segments, interviews. The hosts provide commentary on the interviews and the evidence used. And so again, this podcast provides a useful model for the type of podcast that you guys can compose. Let's get to audio. So here is a link to the podcast itself. All right, so the first segment is going to be the introduction, and they cue the introduction in the same way in every single episode. So every single episode of Radiolab has these sort of like people on the street reading the introduction information, followed by the hosts introducing themselves. So here.
I'm Robert Krulwich. Radiolab is supported by ZipRecruiter. Hiring? With ZipRecruiter, you can post your job to 100+ job sites with just one click. Try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Radiolab. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Radiolab.
Wait, you're listening? Okay. All right. Okay. All right.
You're listening
to
Radiolab.
Radiolab.
From
WNYC.
See?
Yeah. Okay, let's see what happens.
Hey, I'm Jad Abumrad.
I'm Robert Krulwich.
So last week, this is Radiolab. So last week, our reporter Simon Adler took a look at some new technologies.
Software that's coming soon to a store near you.
Yep.
Okay, so I played that clip for a few minutes to give you an example of a sort of like standard intro that you could also create in the podcasts that you're going to produce for the segment. The hosts introduce themselves, and if I had let the clip play a little bit longer, you would hear them announce the topic and the ways that they are going to address that topic in the podcast that follows. So that's a pretty standard introduction that seems like a useful example for the podcast that you're doing. Okay, the next clip that I'm going to play is a good example of a way that you can introduce either an interview or a sound clip. So what you're going to hear is one of the hosts, Robert Krulwich, talking over a sound clip that's the first bit of evidence in the overall podcast. And so as the sound clip rolls, he talks over the clip, explaining what we, the audience, are supposed to pay attention to and how it fits into the larger goal of the podcast. So here it is.
The coming age of fakery will not be met lying down.
So, to start us off,
it's not impossible to hold a lotus position. It's just unlikely you're doing it for these other ways that are described.
I see.
Yes.
We're going to play this amazing little bit of a conversation you had with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I was talking with him at the 92nd Street Y in front of a live audience, and in the middle of the conversation, out of nowhere, really, he began telling me about a little incident.
Oh, yeah, so
Okay, so again, the podcasters cue up the clip and then roll it, and then as deGrasse Tyson is talking in the background, the podcasters explain what's important about the segment, why they queued it up the way that they did, and then they proceed to explain it. So again, that kind of layered voiceover introduction seems like a useful method that you can use in your own podcasts to both make sure the audience knows why the clip is being used, and then also to ensure that that you don't have any dead air time. So again, layering. After Tyson's vignette is done, the podcast signals the end of the clip and then transitions from the first story and its implication into analysis of the clip in different terms and an application of the way that the clip works to support the overall goal of the podcast. Seems again like a useful model that you can borrow in your own podcast. So here it is. Here they are signaling the transition and explaining how the evidence fits into the main goal.
The basis of observation and experiments has emerged in the scientific community. Whipped cream floats on hot chocolate.
And that waiter today is getting a PhD in points. That's Neil deGrasse Tyson at the 92nd Street Y. His new book is called Astrophysics for People in a Hurry.
Coming up after the break, another truth warrior. Although, for this guy, the word warrior might be inadequate.
He's like a zealot.
Yeah.
All right, so I started that a little early. So you heard Tyson and the host, or a different host, the host from the clip, finishing up their conversation. And then the two hosts of our podcast come in, explain what we just heard, and then transition into the second segment. Okay, in this next clip, you are going to hear another lead that Abumrad, the second host of the podcast, is going to provide a lead into a clip of the second guest talking, and it's accompanied by a series of sounds that are intended to increase the tension in the audience. So this is around, let's see, where are we?
Hi, is this Errol Morris?
I think it's me.
Hello, this is Jad from Radiolab.
Hi, thank you for your very, very nice but somewhat disturbing email.
What disturbed you in the email?
The term truth fascist.
So yes, once upon a time, a couple years ago, I did, in an email, refer to Errol Morris as a truth fascist. That was meant lovingly, I should say. Wasn't exactly the right choice of words. Fundamentalist?
Oh, I like it.
But really what I meant is, like, this is a guy who's always trying to get to the bottom of things. He's made all these documentaries, Thin Blue Line.
Oh, yeah.
Got a guy off death row, actually,
Yes, he
in
did.
a Thin Blue Line. He made The Fog of War.
Made Vernon, Florida.
Yeah, but I contacted him because, I'd recently seen him give this talk about this one investigation of his that for me is like the purest example of the thing that drives him. The thing that's
Okay, good example of both using the sound cues to engage audience attention, but then also layering the soundtracks so that the Abumrad can accomplish multiple things at one time. So he both introduces the guest and then also introduces the audience to the guest's credibility by listing the other projects that the guest has worked on. But by blending that all together, it makes it a little bit more palatable to listen to. Okay, so in this next clip, we're going to get toward the end of the second guest's explanation of how he deduced the difference between a couple of photographs taken during the Crimean War. This notion of which of these two, I can show you which of these two photos came first. So is it the photo without the cannonballs or the photo with the cannonballs? It was a mystery that plagued scholars for generations, and so this fellow Errol Morris gets to the bottom of it. And so as the mystery is about to be uncovered, the podcast hosts include some sound effects that draw our attention to these mysteries being revealed. So this is a good example of sound effect that you are welcome to use. All right, here they come.
There is a second photograph, exactly the same as the first photograph.
exact same camera position.
But in this other photograph, the cannonballs that were on the road are gone.
So one has cannonballs on the road and one has cannonballs not on the road, but otherwise they're completely identical.
Yes.
He thought, that's weird. Let me look into that.
And there was a passage in
And he ends up reading this essay by Susan Sontag.
where she talks about these photographs as though it's just obvious what was going on.
He was like, oh, that word.
Well, I don't like the word obvious.
Susan Sontag was basically arguing that the guy who took the picture, Roger Fenton, came to an empty road, put the cannonballs on the road. He staged it.
Yes.
It's obvious.
But
That word.
nothing's so obvious that it's obvious. And so I started investigating. I tracked down Fenton's letters from the Crimea, journals, written records of soldiers who were in that area at that given time.
Didn't find much.
I interviewed 5
Okay, a couple things here. So the sound cues make it seem as if we are listening to a kind of like detective story, and like the detective is getting to the bottom of like a series of clues, right? And so it piques our interest. The other thing that might be of interest to you is you can see the same sorts of structures that we practiced in the last paper. So here the guest makes a claim about the relation between the two photographs and then develops the claim through a reading of a secondary source, so through the Sontag analysis of the essay. So again, remember the rhetorical form from the essay that we wrote, and also the professional essays that we read, is perfectly acceptable and useful, and I don't know, a way to heighten credibility that you're welcome to borrow and apply in your own podcasts. Okay, so finally, here is one last example of soundtrack that might be helpful. So the Errol section, or the Errol Morris section of the podcast, concludes with him talking about the factors that motivate his investigation of truth to begin with, that are tied to the loss of his father. And as he explains what that loss feels like, the Radiolab people have dropped like a soundtrack over the top of it. And so here it is. It's at 23. And that this soundtrack might be a useful example of something that you might be interested in. So here.
The strange, temporal, evanescent world in which we live is gone.
But if you can step between these photographs, you are permitted a brief trespass into something that you thought was lost.
Yes. My father died when I was 2 years old. And perhaps one of the deepest mysteries of my life, who was he? Here are all these photographs around the house. I was very, very young. I have no memories of him. There's a mystery about this man who is central to my life in so many ways, but who I don't know.
Okay, so good example of both sound effect and then soundtrack layered over interview to heighten emotional connection and draw in audience. So again, good example of soundtrack layering that you're welcome to use as a model in the podcast that you are going to produce for class. Okay, so finally, here is the conclusion, in which the hosts thank their guests and then point their audience to resources that the audience can investigate if they're interested. So that pointing audience toward resources seems super useful for what we're doing. Because this podcast is part of like a longer series on this specific topic, and then part of just a long running podcast series, it doesn't conclude in a way that provides like closure or an overview. And to that end, it might not be the best example of conclusions, but we can talk about useful conclusions in team meetings. So, but here is just the final conclusion.
And who I never will know.
Errol Morris, you can read a version of this story and also see the pictures that he was talking about in his book, Believing is Seeing. And thanks to Ira Glass for putting us in touch with him.
And of course, thanks also to Neil deGrasse Tyson. Next week, we'll continue with our Truth Warriors sort of bounce. And where we will land next week is very contemporary.
Very internet-y, very trolly.
And maybe as weird, if not weirder, than the ones we've just told you.
I'm Jad Abumrad.
I'm Robert Krulwich.
Thanks for listening.
Okay, just a quick review or quick recap. The segments, as I understand them in this podcast, are an intro, where the hosts announce the title of the podcast, their underwriters, which you won't have to do. Then they introduce themselves, and then they announce the topic of the show. The announcing the topic of the show leads into the first clip that they set up. They play the clip. They respond to the clip with a little bit of analysis that it both explains the clip and ties it back into the goal of the of the podcast. Then they announced the transition from the first clip to the second one. I have this written down if you guys want to see it. Then what? Sorry. They play the second clip. The second clip relies on a variety of music and sound cues to attract and hold audience attention. They play the second clip and interview, assess that, tied that back into the overall goal of the podcast, and then close out by thanking their guests and pointing the audience to further resources. All right. So that about covers my own assessment of the rhetoric that makes up the Radiolab podcast. So now that I've provided a model of how to do the assessment, I am, of course, going to ask you to perform the same technique. Perform the same series of steps, but in collaboration. So if you would just click on your name, click on the link where your name is in the rhetorical analysis podcast section of today's class plan. Scroll all the way down. I know these are getting a little long. And you will see collaborative analysis of podcasts. So this is the third activity that I'm asking you to do. So instead of everyone having to do all the different components of the podcast, it's broken down into a collaborative activity. So first student, so here Brianna, she's going to cover audience. Second student's going to cover structure. Third student's going to cover segments. Fourth student's going to cover audio cues. And the last student is going to cover the conclusion. So if you would, with a podcast of your choice, respond to the question assigned to you. So for example, Brianna will listen to a podcast of her choice and then respond to why does the podcast you choose attract your attention? Does the podcast cover a topic that you're interested in, etc. And then she'll just fill in here. I listened to Radiolab and whatever, right? Okay. All right, if you don't have a podcast that you listen to regularly, my suggestions are you can listen to an early episode of the Walking Dead cast or an early episode of Dead Fans Talking, a Walking Dead podcast. If you have any questions about what sort of podcast you can or should use, just send me an email and I'm happy to answer it. All right, so finally, for next Thursday, there's no video next Thursday. The only thing that we're doing next Thursday for next Tuesday, November 7th, there's no video, so just make sure that you've watched all Walking Dead up through episode 4 and that you've read Cohen, so that you can take a quiz. The quiz will be like the thematic quizzes that we took during the Lear section, so 6 questions on thematic topics. It'll be hosted through Google Docs and then embedded into the class plan for next Tuesday. If you have any questions about what to expect for the quiz or any questions about accessing the Google Doc, which should be up in the next couple of days, please send me an email. Again, if you have any questions about anything that I've covered today, I'm also happy to respond to you via email or next week via podcast, via video chat. All right, so I hope you guys have a good weekend. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much.